The fog had settled over St. Mary Mead like a grey wool shawl, muffling the familiar sounds of the village and transforming the most ordinary Tuesday into something that felt suspended between seasons, between certainties. It was the sort of fog that made people hurry past windows without looking in, that turned neighbours into indistinct shapes, and that seemed to encourage the kind of confidences usually reserved for darker hours. Miss Jane Marple sat in the corner of the village hall, her knitting needles clicking with their customary gentle rhythm as she worked on what appeared to be a pale lavender cardigan. The monthly meeting of the St. Mary Mead Improvement Society was drawing to its predictable close with the usual mixture of accomplished business and unfinished gossip. To the casual observer, Miss Marple seemed entirely absorbed in counting stitches, occasionally glancing up to nod pleasantly at a neighbour's comment. Those who knew her well, however, understood that very little escaped those mild blue eyes, and that her apparent preoccupation with her handiwork often masked an acute awareness of the human drama unfolding around her. The gathering storm. "I still say there's something not quite right about the new people at Rosemary Cottage," declared Mrs. Price Ridley, her voice carrying the authority of someone who considered herself the village's unofficial moral guardian. "That Mrs. Fortescue and her niece, they keep very odd hours, and yesterday I saw them burning papers in the garden. In broad daylight, mind you." "Perhaps they were simply clearing out old correspondence," suggested Dr. Haydock mildly, though his eyes held a glimmer of amusement. "People do accumulate a remarkable amount of paperwork over the years." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "At midnight? Because I distinctly saw a light in their garden well past 11 o'clock. And another thing, that niece of hers, Miss Sarah Clement, never looks anyone in the eye. Most peculiar behaviour for a young woman of supposedly good breeding." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. "Fear," she murmured, so softly that only Mrs. Bantry, seated beside her, could hear. "When young people avoid eye contact so deliberately, it's usually because they're afraid of what someone might see there. Rather like my great-niece Diana when she broke mother's best vase and spent a week trying to hide the pieces." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Melchett, who entered with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to command. His weathered face bore an expression of barely concealed irritation, and he carried with him the crisp scent of autumn air and something else, an undercurrent of tension that seemed to follow him into the warm, tea-scented atmosphere of the hall. "Ladies, gentlemen, he said, nodding curtly to the assembled group. "I'm afraid I have some rather disturbing news. There's been an incident at Rosemary Cottage." The effect of these words was immediate and electric. Mrs. Price Ridley's teacup rattled against its saucer. Dr. Haydock straightened in his chair. Miss Marple's knitting settled quietly in her lap, though her attention sharpened considerably. "What sort of incident?" asked the vicar, his voice carefully neutral. "Mrs. Fortescue has been found dead," Colonel Melchett replied bluntly. "Her niece discovered the body this morning when she returned from her walk. The circumstances are unusual." The revelation, a shocked silence fell over the gathering. It was Mrs. Bantry who finally found her voice. "Dead? But she seemed perfectly well when I saw her at the post office yesterday. What happened?" Colonel Melchett's expression grew grimmer. "That's what we're trying to determine. The curious thing is, there are no obvious signs of violence, no indication of a struggle. But there is something rather odd." He paused, looking around the room at the expectant faces. "When Miss Clement found her aunt, she was in the front parlour, collapsed near the window. The room was quite warm, you see, and the windows had fogged with condensation. On the glass, someone had written a message with their finger." "A message?" The vicar leaned forward. "What did it say?" "A single name," Colonel Melchett replied, "written quite clearly, as if someone wanted to be certain it would be seen. The name was Margaret." Miss Marple's hands stilled completely now, her pale blue eyes focusing on Colonel Melchett with sudden intensity. "Margaret," she repeated softly. "How very interesting. And Mrs. Fortescue's Christian name was—" "Helen," Colonel Melchett confirmed. "Helen Fortescue. She was a widow, came here about 6 months ago from London. Kept to herself mostly, though she seemed pleasant enough when one encountered her in the village." "Then why?" asked Dr. Haydock slowly. "Would she write someone else's name on the window? Assuming, of course, that it was Mrs. Fortescue who wrote it." Miss Marple's observations. Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting and placed it in her capacious handbag. When she spoke, her voice carried the gentle certainty of someone who had observed human nature for many decades. "If I may venture an observation," she said, "there are really only a few reasons why someone would write another person's name at such a critical moment. They might be trying to identify their attacker, of course. Or perhaps they were attempting to send a message to someone specific. But there's another possibility that occurs to me." She paused, looking around the room with that deceptively mild expression that those who knew her had learned to respect. "Sometimes when people are in extremis, they write the name of the person they believe is responsible for their situation. Not necessarily their immediate attacker, but the person whose actions set events in motion. It's rather like when Mrs. Simpkins accused her sister-in-law of poisoning her roses, when what she really meant was that the sister-in-law had given her the fertilizer that attracted the aphids." Colonel Melchett frowned. "You're suggesting that this Margaret, whoever she might be, was somehow connected to Mrs. Fortescue's death?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied gently, "that Mrs. Fortescue believed Margaret was connected to whatever was happening to her. Whether that belief was accurate remains to be seen." The fog thickens. As the meeting dispersed, the fog outside seemed to have grown even thicker, wrapping the village in an almost tangible sense of unease. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the village green, her mind already working through the implications of what she had heard. The name Margaret was not uncommon in St. Mary Mead. There was Margaret Dane at the bakery, Margaret Weatherby, who ran the lending library, and Margaret Ashford, who had recently returned from abroad to settle her late mother's estate. But it was another Margaret who came most readily to mind, one whose presence in the village had been the subject of considerable speculation over the past few months. Margaret Clement, the same surname as the mysterious niece at Rosemary Cottage, though Miss Sarah had claimed to be Helen Fortescue's sister's child. As Miss Marple reached her garden gate, she paused to look back toward Rosemary Cottage, barely visible through the swirling grey mist. The fog seemed to hold secrets in its embrace, muffling not just sound but truth itself. She thought of the dying woman's finger tracing letters on the cold glass, of a name written in desperation or accusation, and of the questions that would need answering before the village could return to its comfortable routines. "Margaret," she murmured to herself, testing the sound of it against the muffled silence of the fog-wrapped evening. "Now I wonder which Margaret you meant, my dear Mrs. Fortescue, and more importantly, I wonder if Margaret knows what you've told us." The fog swirled around her as she opened her gate, and somewhere in its grey depths, Miss Marple was certain, lay the answers to questions that hadn't even been asked yet. But they would be asked, she was quite sure of that. In her experience, messages written on fogged windows had a way of demanding explanation, no matter how inconvenient the truth might prove to be. As she entered her cottage, Miss Marple reflected that Tuesday had turned out to be far from ordinary after all. And something told her that before the week was through, the peaceful certainties of St. Mary Mead would be thoroughly disrupted by whatever secrets Helen Fortescue had taken to her grave, and whatever truths the name Margaret might reveal. The morning brought a deceptive clarity to St. Mary Mead, as if the fog had lifted to reveal not just the familiar contours of the village, but the hidden currents that flowed beneath its placid surface. Miss Marple had spent a restless night considering the implications of that single name traced on the fogged window, and by breakfast time she had formed a clear intention to observe the three women who bore it. Her first encounter came quite naturally at Dane's bakery, where the usual morning rush provided perfect cover for observation. Margaret Dane, normally as warm and golden as her fresh loaves, seemed oddly brittle this morning. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped Miss Marple's order, and when the elderly detective mentioned the tragic news about Mrs. Fortescue, Margaret's response came too quickly, too rehearsed. "Terrible business, of course, but I hardly knew the woman," Margaret said, her voice pitched higher than usual. "She came in for bread occasionally, always polite, but we never really spoke." Yet Miss Marple noticed how Margaret's knuckles whitened as she gripped the counter, and how her eyes darted toward the window whenever footsteps passed outside. Fear, Miss Marple thought, but the particular kind that comes from knowing more than one wishes to reveal. The lending library provided a stark contrast in atmosphere. Margaret Weatherby, presiding over her domain with spectacles that magnified her pale eyes, seemed almost energized by the morning's drama. She volunteered information with an eagerness that immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. "Mrs. Fortescue was quite a regular borrower," she confided, leaning across the counter conspiratorially. "Very particular about her reading material, detective stories mostly, which seems rather ironic now." She paused, adjusting her spectacles with steady fingers. "She returned 3 books just last week, all by the same author. Curious coincidence, really, considering they all featured cases of poisoning." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked thoughtfully. "How interesting that she should choose such specific reading material. Did she seem well when you last saw her?" "Not unwell exactly, but distracted. She kept glancing over her shoulder, and she asked the oddest question about whether our borrowing records showed who else had taken out the same books." Margaret Weatherby's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who possessed potentially significant information. The third Margaret proved more elusive. Miss Marple encountered Margaret Ashford quite by accident near the churchyard, where the younger woman stood examining the headstones with an expression that mingled grief with something harder to define. She was perhaps 40, dressed in mourning clothes that seemed deliberately chosen, and she carried herself with the rigid composure of someone determined not to bend under scrutiny. "Miss Ashford, I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple approached with gentle hesitancy. Margaret Ashford turned, revealing a face that might have been beautiful had it not been marked by sleepless nights and careful control. "Miss Marple, the village detective, I believe they call you." "Simply an old woman who notices things," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I understand you had some acquaintance with Mrs. Fortescue." Something flickered behind Margaret Ashford's composed exterior. "We met briefly. She claimed to have known my mother years ago, though mother never mentioned her. She wanted to discuss something about the past, but we never had that conversation." Her voice carried a note of finality that suggested the subject was closed, yet Miss Marple observed the fresh mud on her expensive walking shoes, the particular reddish clay that could only be found near Rosemary Cottage. Inspector Slack's presence in the village square provided another piece of the puzzle. He stood outside the Blue Boar looking harassed, his notebook filled with what appeared to be a frustratingly long list of potential suspects. "Nasty business, Miss Marple," he acknowledged with reluctant civility. "Half the village seems to be named Margaret, and each one has some connection to the deceased. Makes for a proper tangle." "Names can be deceiving, Inspector," Miss Marple observed gently. "Sometimes they reveal more about the person who speaks them than about those who bear them." By midday, the village grapevine had produced additional fragments of information. Mrs. Hart at the post office mentioned that Mrs. Fortescue had received a registered letter from London just 3 days before her death, and that she had appeared quite shaken after reading it. The butcher's wife reported seeing someone walking near Rosemary Cottage very late the previous evening. Though the fog had made identification impossible, Miss Marple collected these scattered pieces like a careful needlewoman gathering threads, each one adding to the pattern that was slowly emerging. 3 women named Margaret, each with their own connection to the deceased, each responding to the tragedy in their own revealing way. One showed fear, one showed excitement, and one showed a control that might itself be a form of concealment. As she made her way home through the village streets, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of dying messages. Helen Fortescue had used her final moments to write a name on the fogged glass. But which Margaret had she meant to accuse? Or perhaps, Miss Marple mused, the question was not which Margaret, but why any of them should inspire such desperate communication from a woman facing death. The fog had lifted from the streets of St. Mary Mead, but it still lingered over the truth, and somewhere in that obscurity, Miss Marple was certain, lay the answer to why Helen Fortescue had died with another woman's name upon her lips. Colonel Melchett arrived at Miss Marple's cottage precisely at 3 o'clock, his bearing suggesting a man who had reached the uncomfortable conclusion that unofficial assistance might prove more valuable than official procedure. He found her in the garden, deadheading roses with the same methodical attention she brought to unravelling human mysteries. "I suppose you've been expecting me," he said, without preamble, noting how she set down her secateurs without surprise. "I thought you might wish to discuss the peculiarities of the case," Miss Marple replied mildly. "There do seem to be rather more questions than answers at present." Melchett's expression grew grimmer. "Indeed. We've examined Rosemary Cottage thoroughly, and I confess the physical evidence raises more puzzles than it solves. Would you care to see for yourself? Sometimes a fresh perspective notices what trained eyes miss. The cottage examination. Rosemary Cottage stood in the afternoon light like a stage set, awaiting its final act. Inside the parlour retained an atmosphere of interrupted normalcy that Miss Marple found more unsettling than any obvious signs of violence. The room was warm, almost stuffy, with heavy curtains half drawn and a coal fire burning despite the mild weather. She was found here. Melchett indicated the spot near the fogged window. Dr. Hedok confirmed she could have written the message while collapsed, though it would have required considerable effort. Miss Marple examined the window carefully, noting the faint traces where desperate fingers had pressed against the glass. On the nearby table sat a teacup, barely touched, and a book lying face down with a broken spine. She read the title with interest. The Raven's Cupboard, a murder mystery featuring poisoning. Curious reading material for someone facing death, she observed, though perhaps not coincidental. Familiarity with fictional murder sometimes indicates familiarity with real possibilities. It was then that Inspector Slack arrived with Sarah Clement, whose appearance told its own story of sleepless nights and mounting anxiety. The young woman's eyes darted nervously around the room, lingering on details with the particular intensity of someone revisiting a traumatic scene. Sarah's revelations. Later, when Sarah appeared at Miss Marple's cottage seeking solace and understanding, the true complexity of the situation began to emerge. The young woman perched on the edge of her chair like a bird ready for flight, her hands twisting a handkerchief into increasingly desperate knots. "Everyone assumes I was close to Aunt Helen," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the truth is, we barely knew each other. She was Mother's distant cousin, and she took me in when I had nowhere else to go. I had debts, you see. Foolish debts from trying to maintain appearances in London after Mother died." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, noting how Sarah's confession carried the relief of someone finally unburdening a secret. "And your aunt? How did she seem in recent weeks?" "Troubled. Ever since that registered letter arrived from London, she seemed to be waiting for something. She kept asking questions about people in the village, particularly the three Margarets. Not casual inquiries, but pointed ones, as if she were investigating them." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "And there's something else. The morning I found her, I noticed that several letters were missing from her desk. Someone had taken her correspondence, either before or after her death. The missing insurance, but it was Sarah's mention of a missing locket that truly caught Miss Marple's attention. Aunt Helen was frantic about it the day before she died. She tore her room apart looking for it. It wasn't valuable, just an old silver piece with a faded photograph inside. But she called it her insurance, which seemed such an odd way to describe jewellery. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. Insurance suggested leverage, perhaps blackmail. If Helen Fortescue possessed something that could compromise another person, her death took on an entirely different character. Not a crime of passion, but of calculated necessity. A suspicious encounter. That evening, while making her customary walk through the village, Miss Marple witnessed a scene that added another layer to the mystery. Near the churchyard, Margaret Ashford stood in urgent, whispered conversation with a tall, well-dressed stranger who seemed distinctly out of place in St. Mary Mead. Pausing to examine a rosebush with apparent absorption, Miss Marple caught fragments of their exchange. "She knew," the man was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "She always knew." "It doesn't matter what she knew," Margaret replied, her tone cold as winter stone. "It only matters what can be proven. And now nothing can be proven." They separated abruptly when the vicar emerged from the church, the stranger striding toward the train station, while Margaret composed herself with terrifying efficiency, greeting the clergyman with a perfect practiced smile. As Miss Marple continued her walk, the pieces of the puzzle began forming a clearer, though still incomplete picture. Helen Fortescue had been investigating something dangerous, something connected to the past and to at least one of the village Margarets. The missing locket, described as insurance secure, suggested blackmail or leverage. And now someone was desperately concerned about what could be proven. The name traced on the fogged window was not simply an accusation. It was a key to secrets that someone had killed to protect. But which Margaret? And what truth was worth murder to conceal? Miss Marple suspected the answer lay somewhere between the missing correspondence, the mysterious locket, and the identity of the well-dressed stranger who had vanished into the evening mist. Inspector Slack's frustration had reached the point where his notebook resembled a battlefield of crossed-out theories and increasingly desperate marginalia. 3 women named Margaret, each with motive and opportunity, each behaving suspiciously, and each flatly denying any involvement in Helen Fortescue's death. The arrival of Chief Inspector Craddock from Scotland Yard that Wednesday morning brought both relief and additional pressure to produce results. Miss Marple encountered the 2 officers outside the post office, where Craddock was examining a registered letter receipt with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to finding significance in seemingly mundane details. His greeting to Miss Marple carried the warmth of genuine affection mixed with professional respect. "The London End has provided some interesting background on our victim," Craddock explained after they had adjourned to Miss Marple's sitting room. Helen Fortescue was indeed Helen Markham in her earlier life, but that's not the end of her story. After the charitable institution scandal, something involving irregular child placements and missing funds, she reinvented herself as a private inquiry agent. Quite successful, apparently, specializing in cases involving assumed identities and hidden pasts. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused thoughtfully. How very illuminating. That would explain her pointed questions about the Margarets and her apparent investigation of village residents. She wasn't simply a curious newcomer, she was working. "The question," Craddock continued, "is whether she came to St. Mary Mead pursuing a case, or whether she discovered one after her arrival. Either way, someone clearly felt threatened enough by her presence to silence her permanently." The systematic approach. The afternoon brought a methodical re-examination of each Margaret's circumstances. Inspector Slack, chastened by his superior's presence, approached the task with uncharacteristic thoroughness. Margaret Dane's alibi proved shaky. She admitted to walking near Rosemary Cottage on the evening in question, claiming she had intended to speak with Mrs. Fortescue about some unspecified village matter, but had lost her nerve. Margaret Weatherby's story was more complex. She had indeed delivered books to Mrs. Fortescue that evening, including several volumes on toxicology and forensic medicine. She said it was for research, Weatherby explained nervously. She was writing some sort of memoir about her professional experiences. I thought nothing of it at the time. Margaret Ashford proved the most evasive, admitting only that she had encountered Mrs. Fortescue once or twice, but denying any significant conversation. Yet when pressed about her movements on Tuesday evening, she claimed to have been visiting her mother's grave, a curious assertion, given that her mother was buried in London, not St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's insight. It was during tea that Miss Marple voiced the observation that would prove crucial to the investigation's direction. "I've been thinking about that message on the window," she said quietly, addressing Craddock while apparently concentrating on her needlework. "We've assumed that Margaret referred to one of our 3 villages, but what if we're thinking too literally?" Craddock leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean?" "In my experience, people facing death often think with remarkable clarity about what matters most. If Helen Fortescue used her final moments to write Margaret, she must have believed it would be understood. But perhaps she wasn't identifying her killer. Perhaps she was identifying something else entirely." Miss Marple set down her knitting and moved to her small writing desk, where she kept a collection of reference books. "Margaret, you see, is not only a name. It's also a term used in certain professional contexts. In the legal profession, for instance, a Margaret is an archaic term for a particular type of document, specifically one that establishes identity or legitimacy." The pattern emerges. This revelation casts the entire investigation in a new light. If Helen Fortescue had been investigating questions of identity or legitimacy, the missing locket described as insurance took on new significance. Perhaps it contained not jewellery, but documentation, photographs, certificates, or other proof of someone's true identity or past actions. The 3 Margarets suddenly appeared less as individual suspects and more as elements in a larger pattern. One had questions about her marriage's legitimacy. One had access to information about poisons and seemed nervous about professional ethics, and one had unexplained wealth and connections to London legal circles. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of professional investigators. Helen Fortescue had come to St. Mary Mead armed with knowledge and experience, but she had underestimated the lengths to which someone would go to protect their carefully constructed new life. The village's peaceful surface had concealed secrets worth killing for, and somewhere among the tangled relationships and hidden histories lay a truth that Helen Fortescue had died trying to expose. The fog was lifting from both the village streets and the mystery itself, but Miss Marple suspected that the clearest view of the truth was yet to come. Thursday morning brought the breakthrough that would transform speculation into certainty, though it arrived in the most unexpected manner. Sarah Clement appeared at Miss Marple's cottage before breakfast, her composure finally shattered, clutching a leather-bound journal that seemed to burn in her trembling hands. The young woman's carefully maintained facade had cracked completely, revealing the terror that had been building since her aunt's death. "I found this hidden in Aunt Helen's room," Sarah whispered, glancing repeatedly toward the windows as if expecting surveillance, behind a loose floorboard beneath her wardrobe. "I should have given it to the police immediately, but I was frightened by what it contains. Miss Marple, it changes everything we thought we knew about her." The professional investigation revealed. The journal proved to be Helen Fortescue's meticulously maintained case notes, written in the precise, dispassionate hand of a professional investigator. As Miss Marple turned the pages, a disturbing picture emerged of systematic research into the backgrounds of St. Mary Mead's residents, with particular attention paid to 3 women who had established themselves in the village within recent years. Helen's notes revealed that she had been hired by a London solicitor to trace a woman who had vanished after embezzling substantial funds from the St. Catherine's Home for unwed mothers 15 years earlier. The woman, originally named Margaret Thornton, had disappeared completely after the scandal broke, presumably adopting a new identity and integrating herself into a community where questions about the past were considered both impolite and unnecessary. The journal contained photographs, newspaper clippings, and detailed behavioural observations. Helen had been methodically comparing these against her memories of Margaret Thornton, searching for the telltale mannerisms and speech patterns that even the most careful imposter eventually reveals. Her investigation had led her to St. Mary Mead after discovering that Margaret Thornton's elderly mother had lived in the neighbouring village of Much Benham before her death. Most revealing were Helen's final entries, written in an increasingly agitated hand that betrayed growing anxiety. She suspects I'm watching. Saw her burning correspondence in the garden yesterday evening. Old letters. Evidence of her true identity. Must secure the locket before she realizes its significance. The photograph inside shows the distinctive rose and thorn embroidery pattern from the christening gown. Combined with the birth certificate hidden behind it, this constitutes irrefutable proof. The solicitor's arrival that afternoon brought the arrival of Mr. Harold Fleming, the London solicitor whose telegram had preceded him by mere hours. Miss Marple encountered him leaving the police station, his well-tailored appearance and cautious manner marking him as someone accustomed to handling delicate legal matters involving substantial sums of money. I represent certain interests affected by Mrs. Fortescue's recent activities, Fleming explained to Chief Inspector Craddock, his words carefully chosen. She was investigating a matter involving the St. Catherine's home scandal and a missing person connected to a significant inheritance. I believe her death may be related to that investigation. Fleming's revelation added a crucial dimension to the case. The missing Margaret Thornton was not merely a fugitive from justice, but the beneficiary of a substantial trust fund that had been held in abeyance pending her location. If she'd successfully established a new identity in St. Mary Mead, her exposure would mean not only criminal prosecution, but the loss of financial security she had spent years building. The embroidery connection. Later that day, Miss Marple made what she privately considered a calculated reconnaissance visit to the lending library. She found Margaret Weatherby cataloguing new acquisitions with her usual methodical precision. But the librarian's composure cracked the moment Miss Marple mentioned the distinctive rose and thorn embroidery pattern described in Helen's journal. "That's an unusual pattern to notice," Margaret stammered, her hands freezing mid-motion over the stamp pad. "Not commonly seen in modern needlework. Wherever did you encounter it?" "In an old photograph that belonged to Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple replied with deceptive casualness. She seemed quite attached to it. The embroidery was on a christening gown, beautifully executed, the sort of work taught in institutional settings, I believe. The effect was immediate and devastating. Margaret Weatherby dropped the book she was holding, her face draining of all colour. She had the photograph, but she said she only possessed the locket itself. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with the intensity of someone recognizing a crucial admission. "So you did discuss these matters with her directly?" Realizing her catastrophic error, Margaret attempted to backtrack, claiming she had misspoken, but the damage was irreversible. She had inadvertently confirmed not only her connection to Mrs. Fortescue, but her knowledge of both the locket and the photograph, items that only someone intimately connected to the St. Catherine's scandal would recognize. Miss Marple's insight. As evening settled over the village, Miss Marple sat in her garden reflecting on the day's revelations, while her knitting lay forgotten in her lap. The evidence was forming a coherent pattern, but one element continued to trouble her analytical mind. The name written on the fogged window, Margaret, seemed simultaneously too obvious and too clever for a dying woman's final communication. If Helen Fortescue had wanted to identify her killer, why use a name shared by 3 potential suspects? The answer, Miss Marple realized with sudden clarity, lay in her conversation with Chief Inspector Craddock about legal terminology. Helen hadn't been identifying a person at all. She'd been pointing toward evidence. In certain legal contexts, A Margaret referred to a specific type of document establishing identity or legitimacy. Helen's final message wasn't an accusation against any individual Margaret, but a direction toward the documentation that would prove which of the three women was actually Margaret Thornton in disguise. The fog of confusion was finally lifting, revealing not just a murderer, but a tragedy decades in the making. Helen Fortescue had been unraveling a life built on carefully constructed deception, and someone had been desperate enough to commit murder to prevent that exposure. The question now was not simply who had killed her, but whose entire existence would crumble if the truth emerged. Miss Marple suspected that the final revelation would prove that the most dangerous secrets were often hidden in plain sight, protected by the very ordinariness that made small villages both charming and treacherous. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a woman who had successfully buried her past for 15 years was discovering that some secrets refused to stay buried forever. Friday morning brought an unwelcome development that would force the investigation into more direct confrontation. Colonel Melchett arrived at the police station to find an anonymous letter waiting on his desk, written in careful block letters that suggested education, attempting to disguise itself as common correspondence. The message was brief but devastating in its implications. Margaret Dane was seen entering Rosemary Cottage at 10 o'clock Tuesday evening. She remained inside for 20 minutes. Ask her about the real reason for her visit and why she's been lying about her whereabouts. The accusation could no longer be ignored, particularly given Margaret Dane's increasingly erratic behaviour since the murder. When Chief Inspector Craddock and Inspector Slack arrived at the bakery that morning, they found her in a state of barely controlled hysteria, flour scattered across her workspace, like evidence of an internal storm that had finally broken through her careful composure. The confession in the small interview room at the police station, with Miss Marple present at Craddock's somewhat irregular invitation, Margaret Dane finally abandoned the pretense that had sustained her through days of questioning. Her story emerged in fragments, punctuated by tears and the kind of desperate honesty that comes when maintaining lies becomes more exhausting than revealing truth. "I did go to see Mrs. Fortescue that evening," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the scratching of Inspector Slack's pencil. "She had sent me a note earlier that day, saying she possessed information about my past that could destroy everything I had built in this village. She wanted to meet privately to discuss what she called mutual interests." The tale that unfolded was one of youthful desperation and carefully constructed deception. 23 years earlier, Margaret had been Margaret Sullivan, an unmarried mother who had given birth at St. Catherine's Home for Unwed Mothers. The institution's questionable practices had promised complete anonymity and sealed records, allowing her to reinvent herself entirely when she later married Thomas Dane, a respectable widower who believed he was wedding a virtuous spinster. "Mrs. Fortescue told me she wasn't interested in exposing my past," Margaret continued, twisting her handkerchief into increasingly desperate knots. "She said she was investigating the woman who had run the placement office at St. Catherine's, someone called Margaret Thornton who had disappeared after embezzling funds. She wanted me to tell her everything I remembered about the woman who had handled my case." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused thoughtfully. "And what did you remember about this Margaret Thornton?" "She was very refined, almost theatrical in her speech, always wore long sleeves even in summer, because she had a distinctive scar on her left wrist, crescent-shaped like a new moon. She said it came from a childhood accident with broken glass." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she focused on concrete details. She was kind to the girls, but there was something calculating about her kindness, as if she were always measuring what each interaction might cost or gain her. The forensic evidence. That afternoon brought additional complications when Mr. Edmonds, the village pharmacist, approached Chief Inspector Craddock with information that cast the investigation in an even more sinister light. 3 weeks prior to Helen Fortescue's death, Margaret Weatherby had purchased a substantial quantity of antimony compounds, claiming they were needed for preserving old manuscripts against insect damage. Dr. Haydock, when consulted about the medical implications, confirmed that antimony poisoning could produce symptoms consistent with what Sarah Clement had described observing in her aunt during the final days: unexplained fatigue, digestive difficulties, and a general decline that might easily be attributed to natural causes in an older woman. If someone had been administering small doses over an extended period, Dr. Haydock explained, the cumulative effect would certainly be fatal, yet virtually impossible to detect without specific testing. The symptoms would mimic various common ailments, making the poisoning almost undetectable until it was too late. Miss Marple's reservations. Yet despite the mounting evidence against Margaret Weatherby, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the apparent clarity of the case. The anonymous letter, the convenient forensic evidence, the nervous behaviour, everything pointed in one direction with suspicious uniformity. "I wonder," she mused to Chief Inspector Craddock, as they walked through the village that evening, "whether we're seeing what someone wants us to see, rather than what's actually there. In my experience, when all the evidence points so clearly in one direction, it's worth considering whether someone has been carefully arranging that evidence." Craddock looked sceptical, but the antimony purchase is documented fact, and Margaret Weatherby certainly had both motive and opportunity. "Indeed she did," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "But I keep thinking about that message on the fogged window. If Helen Fortescue was trying to identify her killer, why use a name shared by 3 potential suspects? Unless, of course, she wasn't trying to identify a person at all." As darkness settled over St. Mary Mead, the investigation had reached a crucial juncture. Margaret Dane's confession had revealed the true nature of Helen Fortescue's investigation, while the forensic evidence seemed to point conclusively toward Margaret Weatherby as the killer. Yet Miss Marple's instincts suggested that the truth remained more complex than the evidence indicated. The name traced on the fogged window continued to haunt her thoughts. In her long experience with human nature, dying people rarely wasted their final moments on ambiguous messages. If Helen Fortescue had written Margaret with her last breath, she had meant something specific, something that would be understood by those who knew how to interpret it correctly. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, Miss Marple was certain the real truth waited to be discovered, and she suspected that when it finally emerged, it would prove that the most dangerous deceptions were often hidden behind the most obvious explanations. Saturday morning brought the kind of charged atmosphere that transforms ordinary village life into something resembling a theatrical performance, where every gesture carried weight and every conversation held the potential for revelation. The fog had lifted completely from St. Mary Mead, yet the clarity of the autumn air seemed only to sharpen the tensions that had been building throughout the week. At the Blue Boar, the usual morning gathering had swelled to include nearly every prominent villager, their conversations creating a low hum of speculation and accusation that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. The village tribunal, Mrs. Price Ridley, held court at the largest table, her voice carrying the authority of someone who considered herself the final arbiter of village morality. "The evidence against Margaret Weatherby is overwhelming," she declared, dabbing her lips with unnecessary vigour. "The antimony purchase, her access to Mrs. Fortescue's reading habits, her nervous behaviour since the murder. Really, what more does one need?" "Circumstantial evidence," Mrs. Bantry corrected gently, though her eyes betrayed keen interest in the proceedings. "It does seem incriminating, of course, but I can't help thinking it's all rather too convenient. In my experience, real criminals are usually more careful about leaving such obvious trails." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah Clement's arrival, her appearance causing an immediate hush to fall over the assembled company. The young woman had clearly spent another sleepless night, but there was a new determination in her bearing that suggested she had reached some crucial decision about her aunt's death, and her own role in its aftermath. "I need to say something about Aunt Helen," Sarah announced, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. "Everyone seems determined to paint her as either a blackmailer or a meddling busybody. But that's not who she was. She believed that people who had committed serious crimes should face justice, regardless of how much time had passed or how respectable they had become." Margaret Ashford's revelation. It was later that morning when Miss Marple received the visit that would fundamentally alter her understanding of the case. Margaret Ashford appeared at her cottage, looking haggard and desperate, carrying with her a leather portfolio that she clutched as if it contained her life's salvation. "I need to tell you the truth before I speak to the police," Margaret said, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I wasn't simply acquainted with Mrs. Fortescue. I had hired her, not for blackmail or investigation of my own secrets, but to help me locate someone who had destroyed my family's reputation 15 years ago." The story that emerged was both simpler and more complex than Miss Marple had anticipated. Margaret Ashford had been one of the dedicated volunteers at St. Catherine's Home, a young woman from a privileged background who had genuinely believed in the institution's charitable mission until she discovered the systematic fraud being perpetrated by its placement coordinator. "I tried to expose Margaret Thornton at the time," she explained, producing a faded photograph from her portfolio. "I collected evidence, documented the falsified records, even managed to obtain this picture from a charity fundraiser. But she disappeared before I could present my findings to the authorities, and the scandal destroyed the institution anyway." Miss Marple examined the photograph with intense concentration. The image showed a refined woman in the background of a group shot, her posture suggesting both confidence and calculation. Most significantly, the woman's left hand was positioned in a distinctive way, clearly intended to conceal something on her wrist. Margaret Thornton had a crescent-shaped scar on her left wrist, Margaret Ashford explained. She claimed it came from a childhood accident, but she was always careful to keep it hidden. She also had particular speech patterns, legal terminology used in casual conversation, and an affected pronunciation that seemed deliberately cultivated to disguise her true origins. The pattern emerges. As Margaret Ashford departed for the police station, Miss Marple sat in thoughtful contemplation of this new information. The photograph provided concrete evidence of what Helen Fortescue had been trained to recognize, the unconscious mannerisms and physical characteristics that even the most careful imposter eventually revealed. But it was the accumulation of staged evidence that most troubled Miss Marple's analytical mind. The anonymous letter directing attention to Margaret Dane, the convenient, antimony purchase pointing toward Margaret Weatherby, and now the perfectly timed revelation about Margaret Ashford's true connection to the case. Someone was orchestrating the investigation's direction with remarkable skill, ensuring that suspicion moved systematically from one Margaret to another, while the real culprit remained safely hidden. The message on the fogged window continued to haunt her thoughts. Helen Fortescue had been a professional investigator, methodical and precise in her work. If she had used her final moments to write Margaret, she must have intended something more specific than simply identifying one of 3 potential suspects. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with sudden understanding. The dying woman hadn't been naming her killer at all. She had been pointing toward the type of evidence that would prove the killer's true identity. In legal terminology, a Margaret referred to documentation establishing legitimacy or identity. Helen Fortescue's final message was directing them toward proof of who Margaret Thornton really was. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone had spent 15 years building a new life so thoroughly integrated into the village's social fabric that questions about their past seemed not just impolite, but unnecessary. But Helen Fortescue had possessed the professional skills to look beyond carefully constructed surfaces, and that recognition had cost her life. The fog was lifting from both the village streets and the mystery itself, revealing a truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. The morning brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage in the form of Harold Fleming, the London solicitor, whose overnight telegram had announced his intention to share crucial information about Helen Fortescue's investigation. He arrived carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who had spent sleepless hours wrestling with professional obligations and moral imperatives. "I've been withholding certain information," Fleming confessed as Miss Marple poured tea with her customary calm efficiency. "Client confidentiality, you understand, but Mrs. Fortescue's death changes the circumstances considerably. She had contacted me 3 days before her murder with what she called conclusive proof of Margaret Thornton's identity." Fleming opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope that had clearly been handled with great care. "She sent me this by registered post, with instructions to open it only if something happened to her. Inside are photographs, handwriting samples, and detailed behavioural observations documenting 15 years of careful surveillance." Miss Marple examined the contents with growing interest. The photographs showed candid shots of someone in the village, taken from various angles and distances. The handwriting samples compared correspondence from St. Catherine's home with more recent documents. Most significantly, there were detailed notes about unconscious mannerisms, the way someone held a teacup, positioned their hands, and used particular phrases that betrayed their educated background despite attempts at common speech. The strategic gathering. By afternoon, Miss Marple had arranged what she described to Chief Inspector Craddock as a small tea party to resolve certain outstanding questions. The gathering took place in her sitting room, carefully orchestrated to include all the principal players, the three Margarets, Sarah Clement, Colonel Melchett, and Inspector Slack. The atmosphere was charged with unspoken tension as each participant wondered what revelation the elderly detective had prepared. Miss Marple began with characteristic gentleness, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she addressed the assembled company. "I've been thinking a great deal about Helen Fortescue's investigation and the message she left us. We've all assumed she was identifying her killer, but Helen was far too professional to waste her final moments on ambiguous communication." She paused to pour tea, noting how each person's hands moved, some steady, some trembling, one pair that remained carefully positioned to conceal the wrists. Helen wasn't naming a person at all. She was directing us toward the type of evidence that would prove Margaret Thornton's true identity. In legal terminology, a Margaret refers to documentation establishing legitimacy, and Helen had spent months collecting exactly that sort of proof. The psychological test. Miss Marple set down her teacup and regarded each face in turn with those deceptively mild blue eyes that had observed human nature for 8 decades. Margaret Thornton was known for certain distinctive characteristics. She used legal terminology in casual conversation, something that becomes habitual after professional training. She had refined mannerisms that suggested theatrical ability. And most tellingly, she had a crescent-shaped scar on her left wrist that she always concealed. The effect of these words was immediate and instructive. Margaret Dane's hands remained visible on her lap, trembling slightly but making no attempt at concealment. Margaret Weatherby's fingers drummed nervously against her saucer, her movements open and agitated. But one person's hands had moved instinctively to a protective position, the left wrist carefully hidden beneath the right hand in a gesture so automatic it seemed unconscious. 15 years of careful concealment, Miss Marple continued softly, creates habits that become as natural as breathing. Even when someone believes they're safe, even when the original reason for concealment seems past, the protective instinct remains. The mounting evidence, Chief Inspector Craddock, understanding his cue, produced Fleming's envelope and spread its contents on the small table. These photographs document the behavioural patterns observed over several months. The handwriting analysis shows consistent characteristics despite attempts at disguise, and the financial records trace a complex web of assumed identities and carefully laundered funds. Miss Marple picked up one particular photograph that showed someone walking past the post office, their posture and gait captured with professional clarity. Helen was very thorough. She understood that while documents can be forged and names can be changed, certain unconscious behaviours remain constant. The way someone walks, holds their head, positions their hands, these things become so ingrained they're almost impossible to alter completely. The silence in the room had become profound, broken only by the gentle ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the soft click of Miss Marple's knitting needles. Each person sat frozen in their own particular tension, but one face had begun to show the strain of maintaining a performance that had sustained 15 years of successful deception. The trap springs. Of course, Miss Marple added with deceptive casualness. The most interesting aspect of this case isn't the identity of Margaret Thornton, but the question of what drove her to murder after so many years of successful concealment. Helen Fortescue wasn't a blackmailer. She was an investigator seeking justice. Something must have made Margaret Thornton believe that exposure was imminent and unavoidable. She looked around the room with that gentle smile that those who knew her had learned to find rather unsettling. I suspect we'll find that Helen made the mistake of revealing too much about her investigation before she had secured all the evidence. She probably arranged a meeting to confront her suspect directly, believing that professional courtesy demanded giving the person a chance to confess voluntarily. The psychological pressure in the room had reached a breaking point. Someone's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Someone's carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack under the weight of decades of deception and the growing certainty that the truth could no longer be hidden. Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap, her mild blue eyes now sharp with the certainty of someone who had assembled all the pieces of a complex puzzle. The fog had finally lifted completely from both the village streets and the mystery itself, revealing a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for 15 years. "I think," she said quietly, "it's time we heard the real story of what happened that Tuesday evening at Rosemary Cottage. Don't you agree?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and somewhere in the charged silence that followed, Miss Marple knew the final act of this tragedy was about to begin. The silence that followed Miss Marple's quiet challenge stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with 15 years of carefully buried secrets. It was Margaret Ashford who broke first, rising abruptly from her chair with a movement so sudden that several teacups rattled against their saucers. Her composed facade cracked completely, revealing something harder and more desperate beneath the veneer of respectability. "Very well, Sadie," she said, her voice carrying a different quality now, the affected pronunciation stripped away to reveal educated precision. "You want the truth about Margaret Thornton? I am Margaret Thornton. I embezzled those funds from St. Catherine's Home 15 years ago, and I've been living under a stolen identity ever since." She rolled up her left sleeve with deliberate precision, revealing the crescent-shaped scar that had marked her at the institution. "I took the real Margaret Ashford's identity when she died in London. Her family had disowned her. No one questioned the switch, and it gave me the respectability I needed to disappear completely." The confession sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the room, but Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful rather than satisfied. Her knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm as she studied not Margaret Ashford, but the young woman who had been sitting quietly in the corner throughout the entire investigation. The true revelation. "How interesting," Miss Marple said softly, her mild blue eyes focusing on Sarah Clement with sudden intensity. "But I'm afraid that's not quite the whole truth. Is it, my dear Sarah? Or should I say Margaret?" Sarah Clement's carefully maintained posture of nervous anxiety shifted imperceptibly, her hands growing still for the first time since the gathering began. When she looked up, her eyes held a calculating intelligence that had been hidden behind months of perfectly performed vulnerability. "You're quite perceptive, Miss Marple," Sarah said, her voice shedding its tremulous quality to reveal something colder and more controlled. "But then you've had advantages the police haven't. You've been watching people's behaviour rather than simply collecting evidence. Chief Inspector Craddock moved subtly toward the door, his instincts finally catching up with Miss Marple's deductions. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Miss Marple set down her knitting with gentle finality. "I'm suggesting that Helen Fortescue's investigation led her to discover not just one Margaret Thornton, but two. The woman who stole the money and disappeared, and the daughter she left behind at St. Catherine's home, a child who grew up knowing exactly what her mother had done and spent years planning her revenge. The family tragedy. Sarah's mask dropped completely now, revealing the sharp intelligence and bitter determination that had sustained her through years of careful planning. "Hello, Mother," she said, turning toward Margaret Weatherby with a smile that held no warmth. "Did you really think I wouldn't find you eventually?" Margaret Weatherby's face went chalk white as the implications crashed over her. "Sarah, but the record said they told me my daughter died in infancy." "Another convenient lie from your former colleagues," Sarah replied with cold precision. "Much easier for everyone if the inconvenient children simply disappeared from the paperwork. But I survived, Mother. I grew up in that institution you helped corrupt, and I spent every day wondering why I wasn't worth keeping." The room erupted in shocked exclamations, but Miss Marple's voice cut through the chaos with quiet authority. "And when Helen Fortescue's investigation threatened to expose your mother through legal channels, you decided to take justice into your own hands, but not before making her suffer the way you had suffered, by systematically destroying her sense of security." "The systematic deception," Sarah nodded with something approaching pride in her methodology. "I planted evidence against all three Margarets. The anonymous letter about Margaret Dane, the antimony purchase traced to my mother, the carefully staged meetings and suspicious behaviour. I wanted her to feel hunted, to know what it was like to have everything she'd built threatened by forces beyond her control." "And Helen?" Craddock asked grimly. "Helen was going to ruin everything with her legal justice and proper procedures," Sarah said, her composure cracking slightly. "I wanted my mother to suffer first, to understand what she had done to me, but Helen wouldn't wait. She was taking her evidence to the police the next morning, so I had to act." Miss Marple's voice carried infinite sadness. "The message on the window, Margaret, wasn't identifying your mother at all." Helen realized in her final moments that her killer was the other Margaret in the house, the daughter whose birth name was Margaret Clement, named after her father. As Inspector Slack moved to take Sarah into custody, the full tragedy of the situation settled over the room like a heavy shroud. A daughter's love had curdled into hatred, a mother's abandonment had bred a murderer, and Helen Fortescue had died caught between them, trying to bring justice to crimes that had already spawned new ones. The fog had finally lifted from St. Mary Mead, but the chill of what it revealed would linger long after the case was closed. The days following Sarah Clement's arrest settled over St. Mary Mead like autumn leaves drifting to earth, gradually, inevitably, with the quiet acceptance that comes after storms have passed. The village arranged its face of normalcy with characteristic determination, yet beneath the surface bustle of daily life, conversations carried a different weight. At the Blue Ball, voices were more thoughtful. In the lending library, hands hesitated before exchanging books. And past Rosemary Cottage, footsteps quickened with unconscious unease. Miss Marple observed these subtle adjustments from her sitting-room window, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm as she worked the final rows of the pale lavender cardigan. The physical evidence against Sarah had proven overwhelming once properly understood. The systematic administration of antimony over several weeks, the carefully planted clues implicating her mother, the missing locket taken not for its monetary value, but to eliminate the birth certificate hidden within its false backing. The legal resolution. Chief Inspector Craddock's final visit brought closure to the procedural aspects of the case. Margaret Weatherby had confessed fully to her original embezzlement at St. Catherine's home, though her cooperation and the extraordinary circumstances surrounding her daughter's actions suggested the possibility of leniency. Margaret Dane, cleared of all suspicion, had found unexpected strength in her husband's support after revealing her own past secrets. Margaret Ashford had departed for London, her 15-year quest for justice, accomplished in ways she had never anticipated. The irony, Craddock observed over tea in Miss Marple's garden, is that Sarah inherited not just her mother's intelligence, but her capacity for methodical deception. She orchestrated her own placement in Margaret Weatherby's life, with the same calculating precision her mother once used to embezzle funds and disappear. Miss Marple's needles paused thoughtfully. Children in institutions become remarkable observers of human nature, particularly when they're on the receiving end of abandonment and injustice. Sarah learned early that survival required understanding how power operates and how people can be manipulated. Those lessons served her well when she decided to seek revenge. Miss Marple's final analysis. "But how did you know?" Craddock pressed. "The evidence against Margaret Weatherby seemed conclusive." "That was precisely the difficulty," Miss Marple replied gently. "It was all too neat. Real life seldom arranges itself so conveniently. When evidence falls into place that easily, someone has usually helped it along." She set down her knitting and regarded him with those mild blue eyes that had observed human nature for 8 decades. Sarah's performance was nearly perfect. The nervous niece, the devoted caregiver, the shocked discoverer of her aunt's body. But there were small inconsistencies that troubled me. Miss Marple explained how Sarah's knowledge of her aunt's investigation had been too detailed, her reactions too carefully calibrated. Most tellingly, when I mentioned the rose and thorn embroidery pattern from Helen's photographs, Sarah knew immediately what I was referring to. An innocent person would have been puzzled by such a specific reference. The message's true meaning. "And Helen's final message on the fogged window?" Craddock asked. Helen was a professional investigator who understood that dying communications must be precise to be useful, Miss Marple explained. She wasn't identifying her killer by name. She was pointing us toward the truth about identity itself. In that final moment, Helen realized that Sarah wasn't just her niece, but Margaret Thornton's abandoned daughter, carrying the same name, the same legacy of deception, and the same capacity for ruthless self-preservation. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, the needles resuming their gentle rhythm. Helen wrote Margaret, not to accuse any individual, but to indicate the pattern, the cycle of abandonment and revenge that connected mother and daughter across 15 years of separation. The village's healing. As evening approached, the village settled into its accustomed quiet, though something fundamental had shifted in the collective consciousness of St. Mary Mead. People had witnessed how far pain could travel from a forgotten institution to their peaceful lanes, transforming love into hatred and intelligence into destructive cunning. Miss Marple completed the final stitches of her cardigan as darkness gathered outside her windows. The intricate pattern had resolved into a coherent whole, much like the mystery itself, each thread essential, each colour contributing to the final design. St. Mary Mead would recover as villagers always did, absorbing this latest tragedy into its collective memory, where it would gradually fade into the background of ordinary life. Yet Miss Marple would remember the woman who wrote a name on the fogged window, and the bitter truth that even the deepest wounds could fester across decades, poisoning not just the original victim, but everyone they touched. Human nature, she reflected, was most dangerous when it felt wronged, and the line between justice and vengeance remained as thin as morning mist, easily crossed by those who had suffered too much and forgiven too little. Outside, the village lights glowed softly through untroubled windows, and Miss Marple settled back in her chair, ready for whatever mysteries tomorrow might bring. The November winds had stripped the last leaves from St. Mary Mead's ancient oaks, leaving the village to settle into winter's contemplative rhythm. The scandal of Rosemary Cottage had been absorbed into local history, though not without leaving subtle changes in its wake. Miss Marple observed these transformations during her morning walk, noting how tragedy, like frost, could either strengthen or shatter what it touched. Margaret Weatherby's final visit before her departure for London had provided the emotional resolution that legal proceedings could never offer. She arrived at Miss Marple's cottage bearing the weight of 15 years' accumulated guilt, her composed librarian's facade finally abandoned. "I need you to understand why I abandoned Sarah," Margaret began without preamble, her hands trembling as they had not during all her years of careful concealment. "When I left her at St. Catherine's, I genuinely believed she would be adopted within weeks. They told me beautiful, healthy infants were always placed quickly. I thought I was giving her a better life than a disgraced single mother could provide." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, her expression neither condemning nor absolving. The story that emerged was one of compounding tragedies, built on desperation and institutional corruption. Margaret had discovered the embezzlement scheme already in operation, had continued it believing everyone in charitable work supplemented meagre salaries through creative accounting, and had fled when investigations began, never knowing that her departure would mark Sarah's file as untouchable, condemning the child to a lifetime of institutional care. "Sarah spent months studying me after Helen's investigation brought us together," Margaret continued, her voice hollow with realization. "Learning my routines, gaining my trust, all while planning how to destroy everything I had built. The antimony purchases in my name, the planted evidence, the anonymous letters. She orchestrated it all with the same methodical precision I had once used to disappear." Helen's final gift. After Margaret's departure, Harold Fleming arrived with a package that provided unexpected closure. Helen Fortescue had left a letter specifically for Miss Marple, to be delivered only if her investigation ended tragically. "Dear Miss Marple," it read in Helen's precise hand, "if you are reading this, I have been either very unlucky or very careless. Since you have a reputation for seeing what others overlook, I hope you will understand what I attempted. To break a chain of wrongs begun in a place that called itself charitable. If I have failed, perhaps you may succeed in persuading those concerned that justice must sometimes look backward as well as forward." The accompanying notebook contained meticulous documentation of St. Catherine's home, names of former residents, notes on misdirected funds, records of vanished children. Fleming explained that authorities would use Helen's research to investigate other cases where institutional corruption had destroyed lives across decades. The village heals. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead performed its customary act of self-repair. Margaret Dane, freed from the shadow of suspicion, moved with renewed lightness, her marriage strengthened by finally sharing her long-buried secrets. The lending library acquired a quiet new section on social reform and child welfare, labelled simply "for consideration." Even Mrs. Price Ridley spoke more gently to young mothers, her sharp tongue blunted by thoughts of lost opportunities for kindness. The vicar's Sunday sermon touched delicately on recent events, speaking not of scandal but of responsibility, not of punishment but of the duty to see people as they truly were. In the fourth pew, Miss Marple listened with quiet approval, reflecting on how tragedy could sometimes teach compassion more effectively than any amount of preaching. Miss Marple's reflection: "As evening approached and familiar fog began rolling in from the meadows, Miss Marple considered the moral complexities the case had revealed. Margaret had abandoned her daughter, believing she was providing a better future. Sarah had committed murder, believing she was claiming justice. Both were wrong, yet both had been shaped by circumstances that seemed to offer no better choices. Redemption, she had told Margaret during their final conversation, comes not from erasing the past, but from facing its consequences with honesty. You're doing that now by confessing. Sarah will have years in prison to consider whether revenge brought her the peace she sought. The woman who wrote a name on the fogged window had accomplished more than identifying her killer. She had forced a village to examine itself, to acknowledge that suffering didn't always arrive with fanfare, and that the past, however carefully buried, had ways of reaching into the present. Miss Marple settled into her chair as darkness gathered, her mild blue eyes watching the familiar streets with characteristic attention. Human nature remained endlessly fascinating in its capacity for both cruelty and compassion, often intertwined so completely that separating them became impossible. Outside, the fog swirled around street lamps, softening the edges of the world, and St. Mary Mead settled into another peaceful evening. Its latest mystery solved, but its deepest secrets safely preserved in the mist. Winter settled over St. Mary Mead with a kind of crystalline clarity that followed storms, transforming the village into something both familiar and subtly changed. Snow dusted the rooftops and gathered in the corners of windows where fog had once clung, and Miss Marple observed from her sitting room how even the landscape seemed to reflect the resolution that had finally come to the mystery of Rosemary Cottage. The final verdict. The official inquest had concluded with the expected verdict. Helen Fortescue had been unlawfully killed by Sarah Clement through systematic poisoning with antimony compounds. Sarah's confession had eliminated any doubt about the outcome, though her trial would not commence until the new year. The evidence was overwhelming. Months of careful planning, elaborate deception, and cold-blooded execution of a revenge 15 years in the making. Yet it was not the legal proceedings that provided the most meaningful closure, but rather a letter that arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on a grey December morning, written on prison stationery in Sarah's sharp, uncompromising hand. It contained no apology or plea for understanding, only a stark acknowledgement of truth. "You saw me," Sarah had written. "Everyone else looked at the poor orphan niece, the grieving relative, the victim of circumstance. Only you looked past the performance to see the calculation beneath. Mother spent 15 years hiding from her past. I spent 15 years preparing to confront mine. Perhaps we are more alike than either of us wish to admit. The locket's final secret." Dr. Haydick's visit that afternoon brought with it a small package, Sarah's personal effects deemed irrelevant to the prosecution, but holding profound personal significance. Inside lay the silver locket that Helen Fortescue had called her insurance, the very object that had triggered the final confrontation. Miss Marple opened it with gentle care, discovering not just the birth certificate that had served as legal proof, but something far more poignant, hidden behind the false backing. A tiny, faded photograph showed Margaret Weatherby as a young woman, holding an infant with an expression of terrified tenderness that spoke of love complicated by impossible circumstances. "She kept it all those years," Miss Marple murmured, studying the image. Even while planning her revenge, Sarah preserved the only evidence that her mother had once held her with genuine affection. How tragic that hatred can coexist so intimately with the desire for connection. The broader reckoning, Harold Fleming's final report, arrived the same week, documenting the extensive investigation that Helen Fortescue's work had set in motion. Authorities had identified 17 additional cases where St. Catherine's home had falsified records, misappropriated funds, and destroyed families through institutional negligence. Several former residents were being reunited with relatives they had believed lost forever, while parliamentary inquiry into charitable oversight promised systemic reforms. Margaret Weatherby herself had departed for London to face justice with a dignity that Miss Marple found admirable. Whatever punishment awaited her, she would at least no longer live the exhausting double life of constant concealment. Her final letter to the village had been brief but honest. "I abandoned my daughter believing I was giving her a better life. That choice, however well-intentioned, set in motion events that destroyed us both. Perhaps other mothers facing similar desperation will find better alternatives." The village is healing. St. Mary Mead had absorbed this latest tragedy with the resilience that characterized small communities, though not without subtle changes. Mrs. Bantry organised a charity drive for the reformed St. Catherine's home, receiving overwhelming support from villagers who seemed determined to offer retroactive comfort to the child who had once been abandoned to institutional care. Even Mrs. Price Ridley spoke more gently about unfortunate circumstances and less harshly about moral failings. Margaret Dane, freed from the shadow of suspicion and the burden of long-kept secrets, moved through the village with renewed lightness. Her husband's simple acceptance of her past had strengthened their marriage in unexpected ways, proving that truth once spoken often proved less devastating than fear had suggested. Miss Marple's reflection. As Christmas approached, Miss Marple completed her lavender cardigan and began a new project, a complex fair isle pattern requiring constant attention to prevent small errors from distorting the entire design. The metaphor was not lost on her as she reflected on how individual choices, like dropped stitches, could propagate through generations if left uncorrected. The case had revealed the intricate ways that past and present intertwined in human lives. Helen Fortescue's investigation had been motivated by professional duty and genuine desire for justice. Margaret Weatherby's abandonment of her daughter had been driven by desperation and misguided hope. Sarah's elaborate revenge had been fueled by a child's need for acknowledgement, even if that recognition came through destruction. The most dangerous secrets, Miss Marple had observed to Chief Inspector Craddock during his final visit, are often those we keep from ourselves. Each woman in this tragedy believed she was acting from noble motives. Helen seeking justice, Margaret providing opportunity, Sarah claiming what was owed, yet each contributed to a pattern of pain that might have been broken at any point through honesty and courage. The enduring mystery. On the last evening of the year, as snow began falling softly over the village, Miss Marple sat before her fire with her knitting and contemplated the message Helen Fortescue had traced on that fogged window. Margaret, not just a name, but a symbol of the complex relationships between identity, justice, and human frailty. The dying woman had chosen her final word with professional precision, pointing not toward a simple solution, but toward the deeper truth about how secrets and lies could poison lives across decades. Outside, St. Mary Mead settled into peaceful winter silence, its latest mystery solved, but its capacity for generating new puzzles undiminished. Rosemary Cottage stood empty, awaiting new tenants who would know nothing of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Life, as it always did, moved forward. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily in the firelight, weaving their intricate patterns as the year drew toward its close. Tomorrow would bring new observations, new insights into the endless complexity of human nature. But tonight, she simply sat in quiet contentment, grateful for the clarity that came after fog lifted, even when that clarity revealed truths more complicated than anyone had imagined. The woman who wrote her name on the fogged window had been avenged, but more importantly, her death had illuminated the hidden costs of institutional cruelty and personal deception. In the end, Miss Marple reflected, that might be the most fitting memorial Helen Fortescue could have asked for. Not just justice for past wrongs, but prevention of future ones. As midnight approached and the village slept beneath its blanket of snow, Miss Marple kept her gentle vigil, ever watchful, ever understanding, prepared for whatever mysteries the new year might bring to the deceptively peaceful lanes of St. Mary Mead.